Who's ready to talk about some giants? So, when I'm talking giants, I'm not referring to fantasy monsters or stuff from the works of Roald Dahl or Chronicles of Narnia or, any of the other usual fantasy kind of sources and material. What I'm referring to are a particular group of godly beings within Nordic cosmology who tend to get the short end of the stick, and in some cases are slotted in as a handy replacement for the infernal legions of hell, but with a Viking paint job. The more proper names for the beings I'm referring to are the Jötnar, referred to singularly as the Jotun when you're talking about Nordic source material, or the Ettins, the giants of Anglo-Saxon folklore and practice. Many interpretations of the source material, as well as a lot of strains of heathen spirituality, as I've already kind of implied, tend to slot the giants as a cosmological opposition force to the Aesir and the Vanir. In fact, you'll often see this dichotomy, not just in heathenry, but in many other sources, of gods and giants. And never the twain shall meet. Except, of course, for all the times when it absolutely does, sometimes in the most intimate of ways that result in marriages, children, and close relationships between specific Jotun and specific members of the Aesir and the Vanir. This is not to say there is no conflict between the Jotun and these other two groups of gods. Rather, what I'm saying is slotting it as a clear sort of heaven and hell apocalyptic duel, as one tends to see in more superficial takes on the myth, as well as in some heathen spaces, really does a disservice to everything that the Jotun represent, and can cut off something that is a potent source of inspiration, guidance, and ideas for modern practice. I think you could go so far as to say that reconciliation with the Jotun to some extent, and finding ways to integrate what they represent into modern practice, is something that would be absolutely necessary for building an enduring form of animistically informed and genuinely inclusive spiritual practice. This is part of why, when I talk about the Jotun in The Way of Fire and Ice, I refer to them as another group of gods who are as worthy of respect and relationship as the Aesir, the Vanir, and the other powers who stand outside these three groups. In this episode, I'm going to dive into what we know about the Jotun, how we know it, their most common attributes and associations, their relationships with the Aesir and the Vanir, the concept of reconciliation when applied to the Jötnar, and then just a little nice wrapping things up to bring the whole episode around to a nice, neat conclusion. With all of this said and done, I'm going to dive right in with what it is we know about the Jötnar that survives to the present day. As is the case with everything else in heathenry, there are generally three main sources of material that modern practitioners can draw on. Those are the handful of surviving written accounts, which, as I've gotten into in episodes 10 and 21, which talk more about the craft of history, you got to be careful with the surviving written source materials. They carry a lot of explicit and implicit biases that are absolutely at work in sources talking about the Jötnar. We have what survives in folklore, which does have some of the problems that come up with oral culture and oral tradition, but they also give something of a contrasting view that takes a bit of the more, you could say, somewhat demonic, actively oppositional aspects out of the Jötnar. And then we have modern practice and interpretation. Though, for the sake of this episode, I'm mostly going to focus on the first two, because that's the stuff that tends to spark the most debate, and also is a good place to begin, before then looking to build deeper and more thorough interpretations. And let's be real, there's a lot of different ideas out there about the Jötnar, a lot of materials that aren't necessarily well documented or publicized. So getting into the whole thing of all the different modern interpretations is a bit messy. All that said, I am going to touch on some common tendencies that exist there. To start, we have what exists in surviving primary source material. And as I've already gotten into quite a bit before on this podcast and in a number of other places, this material is stuff that you have to be a bit more careful with than a lot of practitioners tend to be. We absolutely have Jötnar who show up in the Poetic Edda, and they get quite a bit of discussion in Snorri's Prose Edda. There's also quite a few references to them in the different surviving sagas, whether we're talking about kennings or specific references, with one particular one coming to mind being the Loka Tatur, which comes from the Faroe Islands. Regardless of which particular saga you're talking about, all of these share a common bias, and that is they came from a very specific, well-connected, well-to-do strata of society. And we know this because it's stuff that's written down. Preserving knowledge, particularly producing written works, books, manuscripts, stuff like that, in this time period was incredibly labor and resource intensive. This was not something that just anyone could afford to do. Never mind the lack of general literacy and the amount of time and effort it took for people to learn to read and write well enough to do things like document sagas. We also know, when we're talking these sagas that got written down and recorded, that these were the products of the skaldic poet class, who were, folks who were specialized professionals that were attached to these different aristocratic courts in Nordic Scandinavia. These were artists who were commissioned to create these works. Now, this is not to say that's all the skalds were. Clearly, these artists were the product of a pre-existing, deeper cultural tradition that we have a lot of evidence for. But the point more is, the ones we're talking about who are actually doing the stuff that's getting preserved are not doing their work as objective historians or scholars or anything similar. And the same is true of people like Snorri Sturluson, who kind of bridges the gap between being a skaldic practitioner and an antiquarian of sorts. By the way, there's an excellent series at On Black Wings by Azra Sotolaro that is currently ongoing if you want an excellent series of blog posts talking more about Snorri and all the stuff that's going on in his work. What this means is the biases that these peoples had about the Jötnar, which would have been influenced by Christian concepts of demonology, such as they existed in the 13th century, around when many of these sagas were being recorded, as well as any pre-existing biases that came from their also somewhat more aristocratic, a bit less working all day in the fields forebears, who would have most certainly had different opinions about the Jötnar than, say, the folk who are actually working for a living. Now, this is not to say we're talking differences of day and night between different segments of society, but rather that these written sources are being produced by a particular slice of society that would have had their own particular spin on all the stuff that's in the myth. There certainly does seem to be some shared sense of culture and ideas that everybody was building off of, because again, we have lots of evidence for this in folklore and surviving archaeological finds and other places that suggest there is some common ground that everyone's working from. But even within that common ground, you're not going to get the same opinions within all segments of society, especially when you're talking about the folks who are doing the documenting are ones who most likely tended towards the Aesir back before conversion to Christianity, and some of this would have carried over with their descendants and the stories that would have been told to them and passed down. A further factor influencing these biases was the Christian concept of natural religion, which was the idea in medieval Christianity that pre-Christian religions like, say, Roman polytheism, or as Snorri attempts to present in the Prose Edda, Nordic polytheism, were forms of what was known as a natural religion. Natural religions, in this framework, are religions which are precursors of a sort to what is taught in the Bible. Snorri, in particular, elevates the Aesir as an ersatz replacement for God, Jesus, and his disciples. And there are also folk beliefs, such as in Denmark, that the poetic and prose Eddas are the Old Testament of Scandinavia, in contrast to the Old Testament that's in the Bible. In short, even if there was not already a strong oppositional relationship between the Aesir, the Vanir, and the Jötnar before the introduction of these concepts to the saga's folklore and culture of the people who did this documentation, it certainly would have been present as a result of concepts like natural religion. What further contrasts this is the folklore. Namely, that we have quite a bit of it, and there's a number of different stories about people encountering or seeking intercession against giants who are presenting a threat to them in their homes. The Loka Tator, even though it is a saga, is a good example of this as something that survives to an extent from pre-Christian times. In it, to summarize briefly, there are giants who are threatening a group of people who pray to the Aesir for intercession, and after Odin and Thor refuse to step in on their behalf, Loki is the one who goes down to clean up the mess. Other folk tales and folklore tend to follow a very similar vein, when they also don't, in some ways, echo Thor's journey into Utgard, where instead the hero is trespassing into the realm of giants and must escape with potentially some kind of treasure, but at least with their lives intact. In these stories, you get a somewhat different perspective on giants and giant-like beings, who I think could be seen as reflections and cultural memory to an extent of the Jötnar themselves. Instead of being depicted in terms of their opposition to forces that are often seen as representative of social order and society and all that good stuff, giants are more another thing that is part of the landscape. Something that sometimes could be dangerous to people, other times something that presents a great challenge or a force potentially not to be meddled with, though if you do, you could potentially reap great rewards. This is not to say the more saga-based sources are always telling stories of conflict and confrontation. In fact, there's quite a few, like Thor's journey into Utgard, which don't follow this pattern of conflict and strife as being necessarily the norm for these relationships. These nuances, in fact, are a lot more similar to other stories about other animistic beings, like the Nissa and Tomta, or like trolls, where, in the examples of these stories, if right relationship is not maintained, then it can lead to strife and conflict that must be resolved. Or particularly in the case of trolls are oftentimes a problem for people, but usually because one has either entered into the territory of the trolls, or the trolls are beginning to trespass into the spaces inhabited by humans. In short, these more folkloric sources tend to follow this more animistic understanding of whether or not a giant or a Jötun is a problem depends on one's relationship to it and any factors influencing that. Something of a far cry from the norm you tend to see in Christian folklore of the same time period, where demonic entities are nearly always hostile in some way or another, whether directly or indirectly through promises of forbidden knowledge and secrets which come with a heavy price. I mention this Christian folklore because this tends to influence how many modern heathen spaces and practices understand the Jötun. This is, after all, an understandable, though I think not well-founded, conclusion to jump to. If you are living in a society where godliness is goodness, then opposition to and conflict with godliness becomes bad. This makes sense in a cosmology where God is the architect of the universe, the dispenser of law and mercy, the source of righteousness, the ultimate judge, and part of the mythology, which, by the way, this is something that comes much more from Milton and Paradise Lost than anything that's actually in the Bible, includes suppressing a rebellion by his own servants and punishing them brutally for their arrogance. These ideas positively saturate modern spiritual discourse when you are living anywhere within the Christian world, which, by the way, is where most heathens tend to live. It, therefore, makes sense that many heathens, especially when the movement was getting started, as well as for many who are newer to the practice, tend to slot the Jötun into a similar role as demonic forces. After all, the religious expression they've been exposed to the most says this is the way things work. Gods are good, those who oppose the gods are bad. Now, this doesn't really work when you peel back the layers a bit, you read the source material, and you also look at things with a bit more of a critical eye, particularly with an eye towards how these different groups of gods seem to relate to each other and have shared norms and values that all adhere to some extent. But it is an understandable position to arrive at when one is first starting out, either broadly speaking when we're talking about the movement as a whole, or individually for people who are just starting to get their feet wet. This black versus white kind of mentality reaches its most extreme when you are talking about the Folkish, as shown all over the place in the Asatru Folk Assembly's documented materials, such as in their Declaration of Purpose, or all over the place with the Odinic Rite and their material, where the Jötnar are used as a stand-in for the racial and social enemies of the peoples of the North. You can even see echoes of the Turner Diaries in the way that the Asatru Folk Assembly describes the final conflict that is to come between gods and giants, that this is a preordained clash and we must choose the right side. That it also sounds very rapture theology, as one of those things that the Folkish try not to talk about very much, because after all, at the end of the day, their theology is less pagan and more Christian identity with the serial numbers filed off and a cheap Viking paint job slapped on top. But even though the Folkish are the most extreme and explicitly white nationalist in how they work with the Jötnar and interpret them, this kind of oppositional struggle narrative is not unique to them, even though the source material suggests things are more complex than they would appear. And also, just as a personal note, I think if your theology needs devils and needs an ultimate enemy to rally against, you might be already slightly cracking the door open to letting the fascists in through the back way. And you might also be running into some serious moral and philosophical problems down the road. One particular one that immediately comes to mind is a world where all ills are caused by an outside cosmic force, is one where it can be very difficult to get people to take accountability for their actions and offer proper restitution for the harms they've done. That's what happens when your morality is based on waving the right flag instead of being in right relationship. So that said, let's actually get to some of the common attributes we see around the Jötnar in surviving source material. There are two major attributes which consistently show up when describing the Jötnar. These are, first, they tend to be, though not always, associated with the natural world. And when I'm talking the natural world, I'm talking nature in its most raw and untrammeled. It's not hard to see this when you just describe some of the most well-known of the Jötnar, like Surt, the great fire giant, whose inferno is prophesied to consume the 9 worlds during Ragnarok. Or Jord, who is named as the earth itself, and the mother of Thor, by the way. Don't tell the Folkish. They want him to stay a nice ersatz Jesus, and don't really like that race-mixing stuff much. There are also Aegir and Ran, who, in contrast to Njord, the Vanic god of sailing and mariners, are the powers who rule over the ocean depths, and those who die at sea are said to dwell forever in the halls of Aegir and Ran in their next lives. There's even references and kennings in different source materials that survive, where drowning is described as being caught in Ran's net. There are also other Jötun who, while not as well known as these particularly famous mythic ones, are associated with specific mountains, hills, and other land features. There's even the image of a giant man in the coat of arms for Iceland, and that giant man is said to be one of the 4 great guardian spirits of the island. In this way, Jötun force us to look at things from an animistic perspective, because they really run the gamut in scale from this Jötun of a particular hill or mountain to the Jötun who is the personification of fire. in all its fury. These examples of less than mythic Jötun really raise the question of what's the dividing line between an animistic Veit and a Jötun? Or, for that matter, what's the line between the Veitir and the gods, if not a question of scale rather than kind? These associations with the natural world are the foundation of the particular interpretation I offer around the Aesir, Vanir, and Jötnar in the Way of Fire and Ice, where I argue that one excellent way of understanding these gods is as a metaphor for humanity's relationship with the world around us, where the Aesir represent human concerns, society, and those things that are within the bounds of the settled world, to the Vanir, who represent particular crafts, trades, and other ways of interacting with the natural world, where humanity is in relationship with these broader forces, to the Jötun as these forces in their own power and their own space. This framework is especially handy for understanding why you see such a complicated and nuanced relationship between the Aesir and the Jötnar in particular, much like humanity's relationship with the natural world. That's also, by the way, why integration and reconciliation with the Jötnar is seen as important within Fire and Ice practice. If these powers represent the natural world on one hand and humanity on the other, it is safe to say that humanity for the last couple hundred years has been doing a lot of take, not a lot of give, a lot of injury, and not a lot of recompense, and we're paying for it. Though hopefully we are not so far gone that it's impossible to make redress for the damage done and begin the work of repair. This brings me to the other big attribute around the Jötun, which is their otherness. And when I'm saying other, I'm not talking the social other, in the sense that is very much on display in the United States right now, as well as many other places, where the other is something that is identified as that which we are not, that which is outcast, that which is unacceptable within society. The other I'm talking about when we're talking Jötun is more of an existential other, of a being that is just fundamentally not human at a very basic level that permeates every aspect of their existence. This otherness does not necessarily assume conflict, but rather significant difference, in the same way that the wind, or a mountain, or a tree are fundamentally other, though can be understood and worked with. I particularly want to emphasize this distinction between existential other versus societal other, because these tend to get conflated and confused in pagan and heathen theology, I think. And it's important, especially if we're going to be incorporating animistic ideas into practice, to have a clear understanding of the difference between the two. The social other, the social outsider, is someone who has been defined by society as being outside and in opposition. The existential other is something which exists in a way that is fundamentally different from how we do. The social other is a category that is mutable and transitive. It can be changed, it can even be abolished. The existential other is not. But, unlike the social other, which is in opposition, the existential other is simply different and must be understood using different terms, rather than treated as a thing to be used, opposed, and discarded at will. existential otherness is something that can be negotiated and accounted for through understanding, exploration, and negotiation. Which is a perfect segue for talking about the relationships between these different groups of gods, particularly between the Aesir and the Jötnar, who have an extended history of conflict, as well as collaboration, negotiation, and even intermarriage. First, I'm going to get into the whole question of conflict, mostly because this one is well known and needs quite a bit of unpacking. Critical to understanding these conflicts is first understanding a core element of how vengeance was understood in the Nordic world, at least as best as we understand based on surviving material. Anyone who suffered injury had a right to seek redress and restitution however it was they could. And this seems to be consistent regardless of gender or social class. When it comes to gender, there are many examples of figures identified as women in the source material who take matters into their own hands or find their own way to take retribution for injury that's done to them. And while there are also instances of women seeking to de-escalate things, there's also instances of men doing so, because it does seem that it was preferable within this society to seek a peaceful restitution to different harms and grievances done. After all, vengeance cycles are bloody, awful, and destructive, but even so, there does seem to be this sense of retribution and revenge are things that anyone can take regardless of the gender they occupy within society. Where this gets really interesting, however, is when we start talking about thraldom, the Scandinavian system of slavery that existed within this period. Some people who were taken into thraldom were made thralls as restitution for injury they had done to someone else. Other times they were taken as captives in war. Regardless, there is a consistent theme in material around thralls that describes them as cowardly, save for the ones who take revenge against their enslavers. And if you want a great example of this at length, I recommend checking out the Volundark Vita in the Poetic Edda, a saga that is about a man named Volund, who is a great smith and is taken into thraldom by force, and the entire saga is him taking complete revenge upon his enslaver. This is something I find particularly interesting, because when you look at the Poetic Edda, the one most likely primary source produced actually by pre-Christian peoples, most likely, probably, 90% sure, betrays a clear class bias, starting from, again, it's a written document, which takes time, resources, and education to be able to prepare, but also in other materials, such as the inclusion of the Rigsthula, which is a saga that clearly is meant to validate a kind of hereditary class system that was developing around when the Poetic Edda was likely compiled, but was definitely not fully cemented throughout the region. So it is rather interesting that in this material that was likely compiled by someone who most certainly benefited from the institutions of thraldom and stratified society, that they would include a story about a thrall taking revenge against, not just taking revenge against their captors, but celebrating them doing this, suggests that this view of vengeance and retribution as something anyone could do was pretty thoroughly understood as anyone. And whether or not that vengeance was justified depended entirely on the harm that was done to you, not who you were loyal to, what side you were on, why you received the injury in the first place, whatever. If someone did harm to you, then If you could not get just restitution, you could take it. I bring this all up because this is sort of essential for understanding what starts and perpetuates the various conflicts between the Aesir and certain Jötnar and groups of Jötnar. This feud is not something that just happens, it's something that develops. I'd also like to point out, as I get into some of these examples, a lot of these stories involve Odin in particular having a bright idea. Now, you could say that the slaying of Ymir is the thing that sets it all off, and Snorri definitely works this angle where he claims that the slaying of Ymir unleashed a flood that totally doesn't sound at all biblical, which drowned many of the first frost giants, thus initiating the feud. But this, I don't think, really tracks with what we see in all the other source material, where the Aesir are still able to have relatively amicable, or at least hospitable, relations with different Jötnar. There doesn't seem to be a shoot on sight in vengeance for Ymir policy, though, slaying one's progenitor parent figure is a pretty justifiable reason to want to have someone's head in this society. So I can at least see why Snorri would put that in there. So let's start talking about some of the examples where the gods kind of do the Jötnar dirty. This first one is the building of the wall around Asgard. Now, it is said, and this is stuff that comes from Snorri particularly, that after the war between the Aesir and the Vanir, the wall that had originally been built to defend Asgard had been destroyed, so a new one had to be built. The gods reached out to a giant who brought his big old stallion to help get the job done, and the gods promised the sun, the moon, the stars, and Freya's hand in marriage. Incidentally, it would be totally valid to assume the reason why Freya doesn't show up in Ragnarok is because of all the times the Aesir use her as a pawn in their various shenanigans, and finally being like, you know what, this is your mess, you deal with it. Now, when the Aesir made this deal, and the giant of course said that they could get it done in an outlandishly short amount of time, they thought it was ridiculous and the work would be worth it, so they let it happen. And then the giant starts actually keeping up because he has a big old stallion that is helping get the job done. Now, instead of going, oh shit, we made a bad deal, we should have a conversation about this, they instead ask Loki to seduce the stallion and sabotage this guy so they don't have to make good on the contract. If this sounds a lot like any number of New York City real estate shenanigans that you might have heard of, or other instances of a contractor getting dicked around by the boss who doesn't want to pay the bill, yeah, it really kind of does. This does kind of imply people have been pulling Donald Trump-type shenanigans since at least the late Iron Age. That is pretty shady. Then there's the whole bit around the mead of poetry, where Odin goes forth and steals the mead of poetry to bring back to the Aesir and redistribute it from the one giant who was hoarding it for himself. Now, on one hand, the story does fit with a broader tendency of that resources which are hoarded are things that should be taken and shared. There is still quite a bit of hanky-panky shenanigans that go on in doing this. Things like swearing oaths of service and then promptly breaking them, which is a thing that gets Odin, as the only one of the Aesir, with the kenning of Oathbreaker, as well as his name under that adventure of Bulwark, the Ill Worker. There's also a little bit of, let's just say it, sexual harassment that goes on involving the giant's daughter. Now, regardless of how justified Odin was in the grand scheme of things, there is definitely a bit of, hey, watch out, that's not okay going on here. Now, this still doesn't get you the full leap from, And also, to be fair, there are some instances of Jötun who trespass against the Aesir, such as, for example, the whole thing with Thiazi and the theft of Iduna's apples. Or the Thrymsvitka, where Thor and Loki do a mildly successful drag show to get Thor's hammer back after it was stolen by the giant Thrym. And by the way, if someone stages it, you'd have to absolutely milk the parts where Loki is running interference for Thor's incredibly bad Freya impression and making some of the most ridiculous excuses you've ever seen. Now, I'm not making a both sides argument here. More what I'm saying is there are instances where the Aesir and different Jötnar and Jötnar groups have come into conflict, have done certainly less reputable things towards each other, and this certainly is plenty of room for all of this to escalate. For something to happen between when Odin gets the prophecy of Ragnarok and Ragnarok itself, for Surt to finally say, you know what, I'm jumping in on this fight and I'm picking a side, or whatever it is that pushes the conflict past the point of resolution. What's interesting about this conflict is there is also potential and suggestion that it's possible to de-escalate things as well. There is the Jötun Skavi, who is the daughter of Thiazi, the giant who stole the apples of Iduna, who goes before the Aesir, clad in full war kit, and demands that either the Aesir give Weirgild, or she's gonna start messing things up. This, by the way, is the underlying tension that sort of made most of the dispute resolution processes of the Nordic peoples work. It was understood that we should pursue something less than violence, because that is always a direction things could go. In exchange, the gods meet her terms, which include giving one of their own in marriage, who, through the means of a curtain and some feet, turns out to be Njord. There's a lot more to the story than that, but that's the short version. I'm sure Quentin Tarantino would love to work that into a movie someday. There's also the mostly amicable and peaceful marriage between Freyr and the Jötun Gerd, which is reached by means of sending a messenger to negotiate her hand in marriage. Let's also remember that most of the gods have Jötun parentage of some kind or another. Odin, Vili, and Ve, we know, are the product of 2 generations of intermarriage between the sons and grandsons of Buri. In the Heimsvitka, Tyr explicitly names his father as the Jötun Heimir. Thor's mother is the Jötun Jord. And then there's Loki, who is considered Jötun, but then becomes part of the Aesir, to the point of being an oath-sworn blood brother with Odin, who, as he says in the Lokasenna, every time you drink, I do as well. Skadi also seems to stick around after amicably divorcing with Njord. When you look at how these groups of gods interact with each other, it's more like they are different clans or extended family systems that are coming into conflict, but also finding ways to resolve that conflict and seek de-escalation. By the way, while we're talking about Gerd, hospitality also seems to be something that was equally honored between Aesir and Jötnar, and between Aesir and Vanir and Jötnar. We have, when we're talking about Gerd, Skirnir, who is Freyr's sworn man, who does the wooing and negotiating on Freyr's behalf, who first approaches and says, please let me into your hall as a guest, before then giving his proposal. And he is welcomed. He's not just dismissed as, oh, it's one of those Aesir, let's get them out of here, or something like that. There is also the Heimsvitka and the Lokasenna, both of which take place in the hall of the Jotuns Aegir and Ran, who are listed as the only place in Snorri where all the gods can feast because they are the only ones who have a big enough cauldron to brew enough ale for everyone. Not only do Aegir and Ron extend hospitality to not just individual Aesir, but all of them, they are prepared to host even more beyond that. There is also the journey of Thor, Thialfi, and Loki into Utgard, where they encounter the Jötnar sorcerer Utgard Loki, who subjects them to a series of tests before then just leaving them be. This is after, by the way, they sort of accidentally trespass on his land, and instead of just outright doing violence upon them, he gives them a chance to prove their worth before then letting them go. In fact, you could argue that if the whole thing about Fenrir was known outside of Asgard, then such a flagrant violation of hospitality by the Aesir probably didn't endear them with anyone else. The point is, there seem to be norms of behavior and expectation, as well as built-in mechanisms for de-escalating conflict between the Aesir, the Vanir, and the Jötnar. This isn't anything like what you see in Christian tradition, where heaven and hell are constantly at war for every soul, and never the twain shall meet, in different variations and interpretations and what have you. There isn't really anything about Satan sending ambassadors to heaven to seek to resolve this latest conflict peacefully or something like that. There aren't divine marriages that are meant to end wars, like, say, the marriages between the Aesir and the Vanir initially, as well as the wedding of Skathi and Njord. They may all come into conflict, but there do also seem to be some expectations of de-escalating that conflict and finding a way to live together, or at least not actively be locked into a war of endless extermination. This is part of the tragedy of Ragnarok, is we know there's ways this could have been avoided, but something, along with what we know about, happened to escalate things out of control, to the point of a war of all against all. This brings me to the question of reconciliation and integration. If, as we can see in myth, there are ways of reaching right relationship between these different groups of gods, then it only stands to reason that we can do the same, and we can start this process by integrating the Jötnar into bloat and into spiritual practice, as well as in sacred spaces in whatever way is most comfortable for the people involved. It does, after all, make sense that folks who, say, suffered serious trauma from fire or maybe had near-drowning incidents may not feel comfortable bringing Sort or Aegir and Ron into their worship space. But then again, this is a form of spirituality where you can choose to refrain from having in-depth relationships with any or all of the gods if you prefer, and just trusting to your own wit and place within the 9 worlds. That said, just because you refrain from that work does not mean all must refrain from working with the Jötnar. And I think in their case, it is better to be inviting them in and making space for them in our discussions, in our spiritual practices, and in what we do, than it is to exclude and, in some cases, demonize them. This also suggests taking action out in the world as well. If the Jötnar are associated with the natural world at its strongest and most raw, then any climate action or habitat restoration work is also work of reconciliation with the Jötnar and who they are, of making redress for damage done to where it is they are most strongly associated with. Now, be smart about this, of course. I'm absolutely not proposing anyone martyr themselves to nature or something like that. I also think, from a practice perspective, as well as from a broader moral and ethical perspective, There's a lot we can learn from seeking to reconcile with these powers of the wilderness in a world where everything is completely out of whack due to treating the wilderness as a commodity to be exploited, torn up, used, and abused at the whims of humanity and society. Reconciliation with the Jötnar isn't just about doing stuff in ritual that shows honor to them in a spiritual sense. It's about rethinking our relationships with the natural processes and ecosystems our society has long exploited and now pushed to the point of threatening the viability of life on Earth as we know it. We've had enough of demons and take and take. Maybe it's time to move away from beings being inherently evil and towards a bit more reciprocity. So, thank you all again for listening. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, now signing off.